This is part one of the video looking at the United Nations, one of our institutions of global governance that we need to know about. In essence, it takes the form of aims and objectives, roles, power, and influence. So these are the headings you would use to take notes under. The reason we would take notes under these headings are because they are the keywords that would be in any SAC or exam question. No question that you get could be more specific than simply these words regarding the UN. Here is a summary of what this PowerPoint covers. This is part one, so it'll only cover the content on the left. So again, you can see aim, role, power, and influence. So this video will focus on how the UN achieves its aim of maintaining peace and security. And in particular, you can see at the bottom that the example we're going to use is UNMISS, which is the UN's mission in South Sudan. So this is going to be the example or the case study we'll use to talk about how the UN achieves peace and security. The second video to be updated shortly will look at the second aim of international cooperation. If you want to know more about the background to the UN, you might pause now and read this slide. However, I'd prefer to show a brief video at this point. It's a little more interactive and talks about the history of the UN. Remember, no content, no examples that you use in a SAC or an exam can refer to anything pre-2000.
It could be any day, anywhere. A hurricane is brewing. Like many problems, it knows no borders. But as the storm advances across the ocean, it is tracked by satellite. Ships are directed to the shelter of safe harbors. People are warned to evacuate. It's a coordinated response made possible by the international system that shapes our world, the United Nations and its family of agencies. When natural disaster strikes, the United Nations is often the first on the ground, working with governments, aid groups, and volunteers to bring emergency humanitarian relief. This is just one aspect of the UN's work, which includes bringing clean water to communities in need, vaccinating children, helping farmers to improve their harvest, and much, much more. But this is not how the United Nations started. After the devastation of World War II, the world needed a workshop for peace, a way to avoid the scourge of war. The solution? An assembly of nations where leaders of countries, big and small, could debate and seek consensus on common action. Today, the United Nations is the one truly global forum with 192 nations represented in the General Assembly. It's the 15-member Security Council that focuses on peace and security, taking action to avert war, resolve conflicts, and limit armaments. It hasn't always worked, but since 1945, the UN has brokered countless peace settlements, and it now keeps the peace in many places across the globe. From Haiti to Lebanon, from Timor-Leste to Liberia, from the Democratic Republic of Congo to Sudan, and in more than a dozen other missions around the world. Places where others cannot or will not go. Places where innocent men, women, and children have been forced to flee and have nowhere to go.
At home was war. We never knew who was fighting. We were sad to leave, and one day we want to return.
For some 30 million refugees and displaced persons in more than 100 countries, the United Nations family is providing blankets, tents, books, and ways for people to restart their lives.
Please help stop the war for the sake of the children.
There are as many as 250,000 child soldiers in the world. The UN fights for their freedom and helps them to be children once again. And for people in some 30 countries plagued by landmines and unexploded bombs, the UN helps defuse the threat of fatal or crippling explosions.
We have saved thousands of lives.
When the guns fall silent, the UN helps to build national institutions, trains the police, assists the justice systems, and supports democratic elections. To sustain peace, development is needed. Development that includes the poorest, almost 1 billion people on Earth, 1 out of every 6, who struggle to survive on less than $1 a day. World leaders have formed a global partnership that sets 8 goals for humanity, collectively known as the Millennium Development Goals. To end extreme poverty, to combat disease and hunger, to promote gender equality, and ensure environmental sustainability. Much remains to be done by the target year 2015, but a real difference has already been made in people's lives. In improving maternal health, by providing health care to pregnant women. In combating the deadly impact of malaria, especially in Africa, and in fighting HIV and AIDS.
I did the test. My husband also did the test. Both tests were negative.
The UN has seen great success in combating disease. Smallpox has been eradicated. Today, the UN is making strides in tackling polio, measles, and other preventable diseases.
We can point to undeniable progress. 3 million more children now survive each year. An additional 2 million people receive treatment for AIDS, and millions more children are in school.
Schooling is a basic human right, one of many enshrined in the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted in 1948. Decades later, it is still the standard against which all societies and all governments are measured.
No government today dares to say that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is none of their business.
Still, for all too many, respect for the dignity and rights of human beings everywhere remains a distant vision. The United Nations dispatches independent experts to investigate complaints of human rights violations and urges governments to uphold their responsibility to protect civilians. Today, more than ever, the world needs united action to face the many challenges of the new millennium.
We hold the future in our hands. Together, we must ensure that our grandchildren will not have to ask why we have failed to do the right things and left to them to suffer the consequences.
The consequences of a planet in peril. Today, the United Nations is urgently supporting its member states in partnership with civil society and people of goodwill to reach a global, comprehensive and effective plan of action that will address climate change. Uniting in action for the common good. That's what the UN is all about, today and in the future, so that years from now, whenever and wherever the clouds gather, people in need can still find shelter from the storm.
That video is useful in that it provides some background to the UN and its functions, and it also provides a bit of an image of the world and some of the chaos of the world and how the UN helps to relieve some of that chaos and bring states together. Just very briefly, this is a copy of the UN Charter, in particular Article 2, and I wanted to just highlight a couple of small features. You'll see dot point 1 says that the organisation is based on the principle of the sovereign equality of all its members. So there's a real challenge here between states whose sovereignty is respected, but at the same time, by choosing to participate in the UN, their sovereignty might also be challenged. And so there are questions to be asked about to what extent the UN protects sovereignty and to what extent the UN also challenges that sovereignty at times when it sees fit. Also, the phrase sovereign equality suggests that all states have an equal amount of sovereignty. We know the UN Security Council has particular powers to deploy peacekeepers. We know that the 5 permanent members have the veto power, which gives them more power than other states. So we could challenge this idea that in fact the UN does have or does recognise that states have equal amounts of sovereignty. Dot point 3 is also interesting. It obliges all member states to settle their international disputes by peaceful means. Now, of course, states might choose to settle them by peaceful means if they feel like their territory is threatened or a neighbour represents a threat. They also might use war, which is within their sovereign right to protect themselves. So this charter is a little bit problematic. Okay, we need to understand the aims of the UN. The two in red are the key ones that we will be learning, and this PowerPoint focuses on the first one, to maintain international peace and security. For the sake of a SAC or an exam, copy that word for word. In the event that you're asked to identify one aim, you should reply to maintain international peace and security. What does this mean? Well, if we look more closely at a couple more articles from the Charter, Article 41, the Security Council may decide what measures not involving force could be employed. These may include the interruption of economic sanctions, of rail, sea, air, radio and other means of communication, or the severing of diplomatic relations. So what this is saying is that the Security Council might decide that when there is a conflict or a potential conflict, instead of armed force, here are a list of other actions that the UN might take. Of course, that might not solve a conflict or a potential conflict. And so the UN has Article 42. Should the Security Council consider such measures as listed above are inadequate or have proven to be inadequate, it may take such action by air, sea or land forces as may be necessary. So Article 42 gives the Security Council permission, if you like, to deploy air, sea or land forces, troops, military power, to maintain or restore international peace. So that's a lot of power, but of course the UN Security Council has to agree to this, and the 5 permanent members have to agree to this. So it's quite rare that the UN Security Council agrees that military force will be used. So this is a part of how the UN achieves its aim of maintaining peace and security, or one way in which it can maintain peace and security. Therefore, what's one of its roles? To conduct peacekeeping missions. UN's role is international collective security. It gives the UN Council the power to do a number of things. Now, a number of them are: don't use military force. It can investigate any situation. It can recommend procedures. It can call upon member states to interrupt economic relations or trade. But the fourth one is the one we're most interested in: enforcing its decisions militarily. So one role of the UN in trying to achieve international collective security is to conduct peacekeeping missions, enforcing its decisions militarily. We hope it doesn't get to that, but often it does. As you can see here, the UN exercises this role in 15 different missions across 4 continents. Most of them are in Central Africa, South Sudan you may have heard of, Democratic Republic of Congo. A number of those missions are also in the Middle East, in Lebanon, Palestine, Afghanistan, Iraq. A bit more information about its role in peacekeepers. You can see by a number of figures here that the UN has 80,000 troops. So it has quite a bit of military power, or at least they're troops that have been committed to UN peacekeeping missions. If you scroll right down to the bottom of this page, or look down, you'll see at the bottom that it had resources of about $7 billion in the last financial year. So that's how much it spent or had available to use on peacekeeping missions. To put that figure in perspective, Australia's military budget last financial year was $26 billion. So already we can see that achieving one of its roles is going to be difficult for the UN because of the lack of resources. This table just looks at a few countries which contribute the most troops to the UN. And in the bottom right-hand corner, we can see Australia is ranked 73rd. We contribute a mere 64 troops to UN peacekeeping. The countries at the top of this list obviously contribute close to 10,000. We want to be more specific in talking about the UN's role. So after we've spoken briefly about peacekeeping, we want to be more specific about one particular mission, and that mission is going to be UNWIS, the UN mission in South Sudan. This mission was deployed along the borders of South and South Sudan. There was a conflict which went on for a number of years, in particular Muslim fighters fighting for Sudan, which is prominently Muslim, were fighting against Christian fighters representing South Sudan, and the conflict got out of control, so UN peacekeepers were deployed. I'll open this video. Some of the accents are quite strong, but it's well worth watching to see what this mission involved.
United Nations peacekeepers in South Sudan have been urged to rededicate themselves to help achieve lasting peace and sustainable prosperity for the citizens of the Republic of South Sudan. Speaking at an event to mark the International Day of Peacekeepers, the United Nations missions in South Sudan, Special Representative of the Secretary General, Hilda Johnson, said peacekeepers played a crucial role in contributing to collective security and consolidation of peace.
As we approach the first anniversary of South Sudan's birth as a sovereign nation, let us rededicate ourselves to achieving the lasting peace and sustainable prosperity that all South Sudanese yearn for and to which they have suffered for far too many decades. I stand before you as the head of new mission with its new mandate that is bringing a new approach to the needs and the challenges facing South Sudan. And I'm confident that together we shall overcome the many obstacles confronting this young country.
South Sudan's Minister of Information, Dr. Barnaba Marial Benjamin, the UNMISS Force Commander Moses Bissong Obi, senior UNMISS leadership, members of the diplomatic community, and the UN country team attended the event. The information minister said that in the last 10 months since the mission was established and South Sudan became independent, relations between the two had been collaborative.
There is no doubt that the people of South Sudan, Your Excellency, have confidence in UNMISS maintaining peace and security through its peacekeepers.
Barnaba Marial saluted the thousands of peacekeepers serving in different missions all over the world, saying that peacekeepers in South Sudan had assisted in the monitoring exercise during the ongoing civilian disarmament in Jonglei State led by South Sudan Forces, SPLA. During the celebration, 47 Japanese officers were awarded medals. The Japanese troops are part of the 212-strong Japanese engineering company serving the mission. Other troops at the ceremony include troops from Rwanda, India, Bangladesh, and Cambodia. The celebration concluded with the martial arts and Japanese calligraphy show by the Japanese troops. UNMISS is authorized to deploy up to 7,000 military personnel and up to 900 civilian police personnel, along with an unspecified number of civilian staff members. This year's Peacekeepers Day pays tribute to 120,000 peacekeepers serving in 17 missions in some of the world's most volatile places.
So, as we heard in that video, up to 7,000 peacekeepers deployed across South Sudan to maintain peace, help rebuild. This is definitely a case study that you want to look up and do a bit more reading on. There's certainly an enormous amount of material that's been published. If we move to the next thing we need to know about the UN, and that's its power. The most obvious thing to talk about in terms of achieving international peace and security is its military power. So in theory, it has significant military power. We can see the current 15 missions deployed around the world. 70,000 troops deployed. This represents a form of military power, a form of hard power to achieve its goals, to achieve the mandates that are in UN Security Council resolutions. It's when we get to influence that we start to ask questions about what the UN was trying to achieve and how limited have they been. So what have they achieved and how limited has their achievement been? So you could say that the UN has been very effective in achieving its aims. It has 15 missions globally, it has 70,000 troops deployed around the world keeping the peace, and more specifically, in the UNMISS mission, 7,000 troops in South Sudan. You could say these stats represent the effectiveness of UN peacekeeping to achieve international peace and security. We also want to be able to talk about the limitations of a global actor. So you could also say that the UN has been limited in achieving international peace and security. For one reason, the structure of the Security Council. With 5 member states that can veto any resolution, it means that oftentimes when the world has needed a peacekeeping mission, one member of the Security Council has vetoed. And so at times when peacekeepers were needed, the structure of the Security Council was an obstacle. However, peacekeeping is also limited by resources. The UN is entirely dependent on contributions from member states. It's dependent on financial contributions, and you can see it had $7.2 billion to spend on peacekeeping in 2003. It's also dependent on troop contributions. So even if the Security Council does pass a resolution requiring up to, let's say, 25,000 troops for a peacekeeping mission in Syria, if member states don't offer up their troops, there will be no peacekeeping. So this slide goes to how influential the UN has been in achieving its aim of peace and security. This would be the table you could complete to summarise the video you've just seen.